It is great to be joined today by Zoltan Istvan, who is a former journalist at National Geographic, author of the best-selling science fiction novel, The Transhumanist Wager, and now one of the world's leading transhumanists, someone who wants to use technology in the furthering of the next iteration of Homo sapiens. Is that a fair way? I just finished reading, Zoltan, Yuval Harari's Homo Deus, and that's sort of my most general way of explaining what humanism is. Am I close, or how do you see it?
Oh, it's definitely that. I would say that transhumanism is a little bit more radical than that book. Basically, we're trying to merge flesh with machines. So we want to sort of evolve beyond the biological, I guess, proportions of the human being into something that's transhuman.
And when we talk about that, let's maybe before we get into the details of what that might look like, what's the goal of that? In other words, how does your understanding of what the broader goal of Homo sapiens as a species should be lead to or translate to transhumanism as the sort of path forward?
Well, sure. Transhumanism is just a social movement of now many millions of people around the world. And we want to use science and technology sort of as a number one goal to overcome biological death. And I think that's really the main goal right now is this idea that humans suffer. There's 150,000 people that die a day. If you have children, they can die from leukemia. We all lose our parents and spouses and things like that. Transhumanists want to stop that, and we believe we can with science and technology.
What are some of the ways in which science and technology could do that, or at least maybe the first ones that you see as most likely?
Well, sure. Within the next 10 years, we're going to have quite a bit of success, I think. And probably the most important one is going to come from bionic organs. A third of everybody will die from heart disease. And, the heart is just a pump. So replicating it in a kind of bionic artificial heart is not that difficult. So there are companies that are working on this right now. There are a few companies that have already created them to some extent where they actually can electively replace your heart. And that way you could potentially kind of stave off heart disease and things like that. But it's not just, artificial hearts, because most people die from organ failure. It's bionic kidneys, bionic, livers, bionic lungs, and things like that. So that's one of the best ways to do it. But of course, there's genetic editing where you can stop aging at the genetic level. There's even crazy sci-fi things like uploading your consciousness into some type of machine so that your consciousness could survive that way. But really, staying kind of within the science boundaries of the next 10 years, bionics and probably reversing aging through genetics are probably the best winners so far of how this is going to work.
Talk a little bit about how these technologies would sort of change the perspective of humanity on children, because in my mind, it seems that right now, the current lifespan of humans and the way sort of humans exist on Earth is directly connected with the frequency and sort of timing and dynamics and paradigm of how and when people have children. How do you see this movement, if it's successful, impacting how humans see the birthing of children?
Well, absolutely. This is perhaps the most, fascinating topic. And I've come up with this concept called delayed fertility advantage. I mean, it's a very real thing right now that already, if you're a woman and you decide to wait 10 years, you're going to have a healthier child in 10 years, no matter what happens, just because of science. And in fact, a 50-year-old woman in 10 years' time will have a better chance of having a healthy and safe child than a 25-year-old today. So the entire dynamics of giving birth and procreation, fertility are changing dramatically, all because of different types of sciences that are coming through the pipeline right now that are allowing us to do this. And this is way beyond IVF. This is different types of, actually taking skin cells from your hand, let's say, or your cheek, and converting them into eggs or even into sperm, and then mixing them in a test tube and having a child that way. I mean, in all honesty, we're about 24 months away from having children without having to have any kind of partner. It doesn't matter the gender, it doesn't matter the sex. It's just because we can make, cells from our own body now, including sperm and egg cells. And so we're coming to an incredibly bizarre era that will also be complemented by the artificial womb, which the FDA had done some pre-approvals on this kind of preemie bag that would be there for, babies born at around 23, 24 months. They've been doing them on lambs, and now they're getting ready for human trials at some point. And we're entering almost a matrix era. And so this idea of even having children within a 20-year horizon might change dramatically because, if you can do all these different things, I guess the bigger question is, if you're going to live, let's say 150 or 200, 500 years, do you even want to have children? And when would you want to have children? Well, you want to have them when they're the most healthy and the strongest, and you have all these designer baby things coming up, like we saw in China where the guy manipulated the twins that came out just 2 weeks ago. So, we're entering such a brave new era, and I think it's going to change our own relationships and culture. Will people still get married when they know they're going to live 1,000 years? Marriage is a lot longer at 1,000 years than the normal 40 or 50. So culturally, it's going to be a paradigm shift.
To play sort of devil's advocate a little bit, how do we know that these are the areas that humans should be focusing their energies in right now? And what I mean by that is the following. We have incredible degrees of abject poverty in the world right now, less than at previous times, but it's still an issue. People are dying of hunger. People are still dying in parts of the world of preventable, communicable disease. Wealth and income inequality are creating massive problems societally, psychologically, problems of crime, et cetera, et cetera. And from everything you've said, which is a sci-fi fan myself, it all sounds fascinating and I'm super interested in this stuff. I have a hard time making the case that that's the right way to immediately focus humanity's energy. Tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, you're not wrong to begin with. And I worry about this too, someone who's ran for, a public office before. I think the big question at hand is, first off, can we stop it? I understand that we would like to give clean water and food to everybody on planet Earth and end poverty. I want to do that as well. But what's driving a lot of these forces of radical technology are not necessarily people's desires, but capitalism. And as long as capitalism is driving this train, people are going to continue to make new advances and new innovations because people can make money. So whether it's right or wrong isn't even, that's obviously an important philosophical question, but really these things are coming about because Silicon Valley thrives, where a lot of this, a lot of these ideas are coming from and where I live, and they just simply want to become wealthier. The real question, though, is deep down, how can we take a lot of this technology and apply it, and assuming it's going to be here because of capitalistic reasons, and apply it in a way that actually lessens inequality, makes the world a better place, reduces poverty and all those things. And that's really when it comes down to, I think, putting a lot of pressure on CEOs, on companies, especially big tech companies, to say, hey, you have more than an obligation to just make money. Your obligations to make this planet better.
So let's explore that, because as someone who, correct me if I'm wrong, you identify politically as a libertarian, right?
I do. That may change, but I will always probably have quite a strong libertarian backbone.
Fair enough. So in my mind, when I think about when we have previously said to CEOs, hey, you know what? You'd really better do the right thing. When Hillary, quote, went to Wall Street and told them, cut it out, right? We heard that famous phrase repeated over and over again during the 2016 campaign. It hasn't really worked super effectively. So while I believe I am a libertarian with these technologies, in the sense that I believe it's inevitable that they are coming if they're possible, and thus we should figure out how to make them work to our advantage and to the greatest advantage, are you ready to say that regulation is going to need to be a factor here if they are not going to be technologies that merely allow inequality to grow to the point where you won't have just wealth inequality and resource inequality, but you will have lifespan inequality on the basis of what technologies you can afford?
So I'm, as someone with a libertarian background, I'm not willing to say that. I think the marketplace will allow these technologies to develop, and then it'll be up to people themselves to, if there's this constant battle on Facebook, like, oh, Facebook's doing this, Facebook doing that. There's a really simple answer for everybody on Facebook. Just stop using it. That's how you sync companies. And I think the same thing can be said of a lot of these technologies. If people decide not to use a lot of these technologies, they won't have the economic prowess to essentially survive. So I think the transhumanist age is going to be born not only upon capitalism, and it will appear because of capitalism, but it'll be because humanity chooses to go down that path, or not down that path, especially in the world of social media, where we can kind of immediately voice sometimes our opinions.
Yeah,
And
but hold
I
on a
think,
second. Let me see if I can, because I don't want to get too far past the argument you made. If people don't like the way it's going, then they can operate in the free market to punish that company. Customers can quit, like with Facebook, whatever. We could
yes.
say right now, I mean, internet service providers are one of the most disliked companies it's an industry filled with disliked companies. And the argument you just made literally doesn't work because they have legalized monopolies, right? They have legalized monopolies. And if you are in many parts of the country, your choice is, okay, fine, I can quit, but then I don't have internet at all. That is similar to what could happen, right? So just saying the market will figure it out, it's already not happening.
Well, I think there's a big difference between telecom companies and, let's say, something like Facebook or technology companies that would bring out an actual product. I agree. We've legalized now the entire telecom system. So if you want to get onto the internet, you really only have one or two choices, and they're both under the government's in the government's back pocket. But I think still a lot of ways, like let's say a company brings out something like a brand new way to have children in an artificial womb, and
Sure.
everyone says, okay, this is the designer baby age, and only the rich can afford it. And, at some point, the company wants to make this available to the poor because they want to grow. And I don't mean poor, but just anybody. And at that point, everybody can say, you know what, we're not going to have a child that ends up in a test tube baby because it ends up, being something different. And we want to stop this company, which is, creating more inequality. Now, that's what can be done. And that's the libertarian perspective. The problem, though, with that is that if the majority of the world chooses not to adapt some of these radical technologies, then you have a generation of rich kids with higher IQs
Correct.
than everybody else. Then you run into this situation. But ultimately, I'm still going to side with a lot of the libertarian-esque ideas where we need to let this run its course. But there are methods that the rest of the world can do to shut down companies. I don't want to go as far as regulation, but if that rest of the world wants to pass regulation and they can get it through Congress, then of course that's their imperative.
Yeah, I mean, I think here we just disagree. I think we've already seen that this has failed. We've seen that it has failed on climate change. We've seen that it has failed with ISPs. And we can definitely say, well, those industries are all different than what you're talking about because of this or that characteristic. But we may just not agree on that. So let's not get bogged down on it because there are a lot of other things that I do want to get to. When we talk a little bit about the idea of commoditizing a life, are you at all concerned that some of the technologies that may be available in the next 10, 20, 50 years start to move life from something that is sort of beyond markets and products and services into somewhat of a commodity? Is that a concern that you have?
Yes, absolutely. And I would be very surprised just, even as a libertarian, if capitalism survives beyond 25 years. So we're going to be entering into a very different space. And the reason I say that is because automation and robots are simply going to take jobs. And they're going to take basically all jobs, probably 98, 99% of all jobs over the next 50 years, certainly before the century is out. So we will have to develop economic models that are totally different. And that economic model might mean that humans have been commoditized to some extent, that we all take upgrades to our bodies as almost in the same way cars do. But the greater picture is that humans don't die from disease. Humans don't suffer from maladies. We don't, we're not, the specter of death is not always haunting us. The transhumanist age is really about eliminating suffering. So whether we're commoditized or not is not the biggest issue, I think, to most transhumanists. What's the biggest issue is that we don't lose loved ones to disease and have to bury them. And for those of us who don't believe in an afterlife, that's the end. And so it's this is a war against aging and a war against biological death, whether we're commoditized or not.
Assuming that one can afford it, of course, which was part of what we already started sort of digging into. And maybe we'll talk about that a little more in part two of the interview. We've been speaking with Zoltan Istvan, who is a former journalist at National Geographic, author of the science fiction novel, The Transhumanist Wager, and one of the world's leading humanists. We'll continue our conversation with him on tomorrow's program. We're continuing our conversation today with Zoltan Istvan, who's a former journalist at National Geographic, author of the best-selling science fiction novel, The Transhumanist Wager, and one of the world's leading transhumanists. So maybe now we'll move a little bit from the sort of societal impact that we discussed in part one into maybe some of the technologies and paths forward. I got questions from followers on Twitter who want to know about the bringing back to life of people being cryogenically frozen, whether you agree or disagree with Aubrey de Grey's perspective on, quote, curing aging, what technologies you see coming from CRISPR. So maybe we'll start very generally. What do you see as the most likely and promising specific technologies to be first implemented?
Well, cryonics is really the only thing. Cryonics is when you freeze people. And I've been to Alcor in Arizona, and you freeze people in hopes of bringing them back in 35, 50, or 100 years. And I absolutely think that that's a viable science and a real thing. And I would do it if I knew I was going to die of cancer tomorrow. But I think the real technologies that everybody's hoping here for the next 10, 20, 30 years is probably using genetic editing of some sort, probably way beyond CRISPR, to reverse the way our cells age, and then to make it so that we can live a lot longer. And we have this kind of term where if you can live 1 year now, you're going to gain another year in the future based on how fast the trajectory of life extension science is evolving. So it's critical over the next 10 or 15 years, especially some of your older people in your audience, to try to stay alive, because we are at the cusp of a revolution right now in the life extension sciences, where very soon there will be pills on the market that will probably be somewhat functional, making you live a little bit longer, and we'll have bionic organs that will be routinely put into people, and we'll have different types of methods of just simply keeping you alive longer. And the more length you can stay alive, if you can make it to like 80 or 90, and I'm about 45 right now, it's almost guaranteed you're going to make it to 1,000. So it's really critical over the next 20 or 30 years to try to stay alive because of all these coming technologies.
So this is the concept, I think, that Aubrey de Grey describes as the longevity escape velocity, right? That
Exactly.
Once technology starts to develop more quickly than aging takes its toll, so to speak, every additional year you live might give you a year and a week to live or something like that. And then you can kind of extrapolate that out. Do you agree that right now aging is happening more quickly than the development of new longevity science?
No, I think already today we're gaining that extra year. I think already that principle of the longevity escape velocity is happening right now. So and the reason I say that is only because in the last 24, maybe 36 months, genetic editing has so quickly changed the nature of biological science, where, it's hard to overestimate how important CRISPR and genetic editing technology is. This idea that we can kind of go in and finally treat the human being as a machine, get in the building blocks of DNA and reconfigure it. It's safe to say within 20 years, we could be at the cusp of a Star Wars era where people will be growing a third eye on the back of their head. They'll be growing a third and fourth limb. They'll be able to grow tails, grow themselves 10 feet tall. We are coming to an era when we can literally change the way the biological structure is of the human being. And of course, that will allow us also to hopefully eliminate most aspects of aging.
So why haven't we seen that? Or I guess let me ask it a different way. Are there any data in which we see that reflected? Because when I see, over the last 5 years, we've not seen a 5-year increase in life expectancy or even in life expectancy at age 5, which would account for infant mortality. So are there data that say what you're saying, which is that we already have science outrunning the effects of aging?
No. So right now it doesn't look like that. But this is sort of an extrapolation of just the next 10 to 15 years. But the reality, though, is, if you look, unfortunately, people in America are dying more frequently than before and less age. But a lot of it has to do with obesity. And this is, again, gets a very controversial topic. But if you look at overwhelmingly the people that are wealthy and the people that tend to keep good health of their bodies, they are living longer than ever before. And really the key there is to stay healthy and try to stay skinny, of course. That's probably the number one thing, and active, as well as if you have money for these types of treatments, you will live longer than ever before. And that's a statistical fact at this point. The problem, though, is that doesn't apply to a large amount of people. And so when we hear the statistics, we think, oh, America is dying more young than ever. Well, then, we stop that trend of continuing to extend our lifespans. And that's, again, where we get back to this controversy, where if you have the money and you have the proper trainers and stuff like that, you can live longer than ever.
What do you make of the idea that is out there that there is this sort of 90 to 110 range as the sort of natural maximum age for a human body? And I know that when we talk about transhumanism, you're starting to talk about blending human bodies with technology and that may extend beyond that. Do you agree with the sort of starting point that 90 to 110, as even if you can avoid particular acute diseases, even if you can avoid being run over by a car or whatever else, that seems to be the sort of natural maximum life for a human body as it exists today?
That sounds about right. But, of course, in the transhumanist age, we're not talking about anything natural. I mean, with genetic editing, we're talking about restructuring the cell in itself. With, transhumanism, we're talking about trying to eradicate eating, trying to eradicate drinking, trying to eradicate breathing air at all, and with the biolung and things like that. I mean, we're hoping in the next 25 years, maybe half of our body, and this probably is too optimistic, but definitely in the next 40 years, half our body or close to half our body would be entirely synthetic parts, cyborg parts that last dramatically longer and don't need nearly as much of the care that biology does, which is, biology is a system that's literally doomed to age from the point every cell is created to the point that it dies. And we want systems like a car where you could literally replace all the parts so that you could continue on indefinitely. The biggest problem we're going to have is with the brain, because we don't understand the brain enough. But there is a good possibility that definitely within 40 or 50 years, we might be able to augment the brain through uploading, consciousness to some extent to machines, or also just through a media flurry and understanding exactly who we are through all these different other elements, and maybe a combination of the brain, or through stem cell technology. Stem cell technology, who would have thought, is becoming one of the most promising things, where you can rejuvenate virtually all parts of the body. So that's the way that you would actually try to stay alive beyond that 110 age. That might be a limit of where you are as a human being. I think there's no limit, but we must treat the human being as like a car. It must be a machine to be constantly maintained and updated.
You mentioned stem cells. Are there any technologies or directions that you think should not be explored, that should be off limits for moral reasons?
Well, the only thing that I would say, and this is quite different than aging, is I'm like many of the other, I guess, futurists out there. I'm worried about AI. I understand the Terminator scenario, and I think creating an intelligence that's smarter than us on planet Earth is a very, very dangerous thing. So I would say let's stay away from AI. But there's nothing in the way of genetic editing that I would say stop at all. I would say if we can increase our IQ, if we can make ourselves stronger, taller, if we can change our any color of our skin, we can change any color of our eyes, we can do anything we want. I would say 100% do it. If we could become something that's unrecognizable to the human being, but more functional in the living world, I would say do it. It's really only AI that I'm a little bit skeptical of as a technologist.
So let's talk about the point of all this, right? An increasingly common discussion I have with economists who talk about achieving growth is, let's break down, why are we talking about infinite and indefinite growth as the target? Like, why would that be good? Let's defend that rather than assume it and figure out how to do it. Let's say that things go roughly the way you're predicting or suggesting that they might go. Humans have essentially unlimited lifespans. They're not immortal, but maybe they are amortal for all intents and purposes. We solve a lot of the issues that we're currently dealing with. Imagine whatever scenario you want. Then what? What then becomes the sort of purpose or mission of Homo sapiens in the universe?
Well, I think we have to get rid of the Homo sapiens. I mean, we have to understand that we weren't Homo sapiens, 2 million years ago, and we're not going to be Homo sapiens in 500 years. We are an evolving trajectory of intelligent life that somehow got very lucky, I think, through an evolutionary perspective and ended up here on planet Earth in 2018. And we're going to become something different. That's probably much more machine-like. It's probably pure AI, where we'll be just ones and zeros. And I think the AI age will only last 10 or 15 years, because beyond that will be some kind of quantum intelligence age or something else. I mean, the whole trajectory of the microprocessor, which is the basis of transhumanism, is that it's sort of Moore's law. And Moore's law may not be, 100% on. There's no question that over the last 50 years, the microchip has, just been evolving and evolving and evolving, getting faster and smaller. And at some point, we become so accelerated in technological development as entities with that technology that we become a totally different species. So what's our purpose?
Right.
Honestly, I don't know that, and I don't try to pretend to tell others what that purpose is. For me, it's going to be maybe happiness and maybe even love with my family, even if that family is consciousness uploaded into an AI. But one thing is for sure, dying a biological death is not something that I want to do or I would ever wish on anyone else. So transhumanists, as kind of a first priority, want to overcome that. What's the future? Maybe outer space travel and all these other things? I don't know, but certainly overcoming biological death is really the main goal of transhumanists right now.
Will having fun be a thing in the future if all of this happens?
I'm not 100% sure. I'm not sure fun is really, fun may have been something from an evolutionary perspective that we developed to make us want to procreate and drink and have, enjoy ourselves. But enjoying ourselves might not be what a really sophisticated entity that's maybe a million times smarter than ourselves, when we're all jacked into AI or something like this, will want to do. Maybe it'll be much more functional, much more meaning based. I think it could be very even deeply spiritual in some kind of strange way, even though I'm a secular person, but something that would be more based on pure meaning and being driven to explore the universe, maybe curiosity. I'm not sure fun is really part of the transhumanist repertoire.
At what point does this ideology become dogmatic in a way that's similar to religious belief? And I'm not saying, I'm not like, I'm a non-religious person myself, and I don't fall into the, atheism is a dogma just like religion type of thing. But when I hear you talk about, fun may just simply not be a thing, and we're going to be able to have meaning in ways that we can't even necessarily conceive of right now. There is a sort of dogmatism, I think you would agree, with a sort of idealization of what this would be like.
Oh, there's no question. And if you talk to Christians, let's say, about transhumanism, they're like, oh, it has so many religious elements because here you want to overcome death and you want to live this life in utopian. There's no question about that. But just, at the very core of transhumanism is the scientific method. We're not trying to create anything dogmatic. We're always just trying to accelerate reason and science and base things on how we can create and innovate better, and knowing that we can always do better. We're always going to be wrong. It's never going to be a matter that transhumanists are right unless somehow they become so godlike that their brains or their intelligence span the universe. But more likely here in the next tens of thousands of years, we're just going to be an organized intelligence trying to evolve itself and trying to explore our universe and make sense of it and make meaning of it.
We've been speaking with Zoltan Istvan, who's a former journalist at National Geographic, author of the best-selling science fiction novel, The Transhumanist Wager, and one of the world's leading transhumanists. Really great talking to you. I appreciate your time today.
Oh, it was fascinating talking to you too. Thank you.